I've spent most of my life telling stories about good and evil, about justice and redemption, but 3 weeks ago I had an experience that made me question everything I thought I knew about faith. Jesus appeared to me in a dream, and what he showed me about his church, it broke my heart, and I think it's going to break yours too. But before I tell you which 3 churches he showed me, let me explain how this all started. I'm not the kind of man who talks about visions and spiritual experiences. I'm practical. I deal in what I can see, what I can direct, what I can put on film. So when I tell you this happened, understand that I've questioned it. I've wondered if I was losing my grip on reality. But the clarity of what I saw, the weight of what I felt, it won't let me dismiss it. It was a Tuesday evening. I'd been reading before bed, some history book I can't even remember now. My wife was already asleep down the hall. The house was quiet, except for the wind outside, that particular sound the California coast makes at night. I turned off the light around 11 and fell asleep without trouble, and then I was somewhere else.
Not gradually, the way dreams usually start.
One moment I was in my bed, the next I was standing in a place I'd never been. It looked like a church sanctuary, but not any specific one I recognized. The architecture was a blend of styles, as if every church I'd ever seen had been combined into one space. High ceilings, stained glass windows, wooden pews stretching back into shadow. But I wasn't alone. He was standing at the front near what would have been the altar, and I knew immediately who it was. You know how sometimes in dreams you just know things without being told? It was like that, but more certain than any dream I'd ever had. Jesus. Not the pale, gentle figure from Sunday school paintings. This was a man who had worked with his hands, who had walked dusty roads, who carried both authority and compassion in equal measure. His eyes, when they met mine, saw everything. Every lie I'd told, every compromise I'd made, every moment of pride and fear and weakness. But there was no condemnation in that gaze, just a profound sadness. "Clint," he said, and his voice was quiet but carried through the empty sanctuary like a bell. "I want to show you something that's been on my heart, something I need you to understand." I couldn't speak, I just nodded. "I'm going to take you to 3 churches," he continued. 3 places where people gather in my name, and I want you to see what I see. I want you to understand why these churches, despite their beliefs and their buildings and their traditions, don't truly belong to me. The first church he showed me looked exactly like success. Suddenly we were somewhere else. A massive building, modern architecture, glass and steel and perfectly landscaped grounds. The parking lot was enormous, filled with expensive cars, BMWs, Mercedes, Teslas. Inside, the sanctuary looked more like a concert hall than a traditional church. Stadium seating for thousands, multiple screens showing close-ups of the stage, production quality that would rival any major network broadcast. The service was in progress. The worship band was excellent, truly professional. The lighting was perfect. The congregation was singing along, hands raised, eyes closed, faces showing what looked like genuine emotion. Everything about it screamed success. "This church has 30,000 members," Jesus said quietly, standing beside me. "The pastor is a best-selling author. They run dozens of programs. Their budget is larger than some small countries. By every metric the world uses to measure success, this church is winning." "Then what's wrong with it?" I asked. He looked at me with that same profound sadness. I watched. The pastor took the stage to enormous applause. He was charismatic, polished, perfectly styled. His sermon was motivational, uplifting. He talked about God's plan for prosperity, about claiming your blessings, about living your best life. The congregation responded enthusiastically. They took notes. They nodded. They clapped. But Jesus shook his head slowly. "Do you see it?" he asked. "I see a lot of people who seem happy," I said. "Look deeper." And somehow I could. It was like a veil lifted. I could see beneath the surface, into the hearts of the people filling those seats. And what I saw disturbed me. The man in the front row was thinking about his quarterly earnings. The woman next to him was mentally redecorating her house. The family behind them was there because it was good for their social network, good for business connections. Row after row, I saw people who had come to this place seeking comfort, seeking validation, seeking prosperity, seeking a spiritual stamp of approval for the lives they were already living. But very few were seeking him. "This church belongs to Mammon," Jesus said, and his voice carried a weight that made my chest tighten. It has my name on the sign outside. It quotes my words from the stage, but its heart belongs to money, to success, to the American dream dressed up in religious language. But they're not bad people, I protested. They're worshiping a false god, he interrupted gently. They think they're worshiping me, but they've created a version of me that exists only to bless their ambitions. I called people to take up their cross and follow me. This church tells them to claim their crown and prosper. I said the last shall be first. They teach that faith leads to earthly success. I told a rich young ruler to sell everything and follow me. This church would tell him to invest wisely and tithe 10%. He gestured toward the stage where the pastor was building to his conclusion, calling people to sow a seed of faith with a generous offering. The leadership here has built an empire in my name, Jesus continued. They have become rich, teaching people that I want them to be rich. They live in mansions while claiming to serve the one who had nowhere to lay his head. And the people, they love it because this gospel asks nothing hard of them. It requires no sacrifice, no real change, no death to self. Just believe, give, and prosper. What happens to them, I asked, feeling a chill despite the warmth of the space. They drift, he said quietly. They think they're following me, but they're following a comfortable fiction. And when real suffering comes, when the prosperity doesn't materialize, when life doesn't work out like the sermons promised, they'll either blame themselves for lacking faith or they'll abandon faith entirely, because the version of me they've been taught was never real to begin with. And then he took me to the second church. And what I saw there was even more troubling. We were suddenly in a different building, smaller than the first, but still substantial. The architecture was more traditional, older. Inside, the atmosphere was intense. The worship was loud, passionate, almost frantic. People were shouting. Some were speaking in tongues. Others were weeping openly. At first, I thought, this must be better. These people are really feeling something. But Jesus' expression grew even more pained. Watch, he said again. The preacher, a man in his 50s with a commanding presence, began his sermon. He spoke about spiritual warfare, about demons, about the power believers have to command and decree. He talked about health and healing, declaring that sickness was always a sign of insufficient faith or unconfessed sin. He promised that God wanted to do miracles, wanted to prove himself, wanted to show his power through his faithful ones. The congregation responded with fervor. Yes, they shouted. Amen, they cried. The energy was electric. But Jesus looked like he was in pain. Do you see it? He asked me. This time I looked harder, tried to see what he was seeing, and slowly it became clear. These people weren't pursuing him. They were pursuing an experience. They weren't seeking transformation. They were seeking a spiritual high, a feeling of power, a sense of being special. This church belongs to pride, Jesus said, not the obvious kind, the subtle kind. The kind that dresses itself up as faith, but is really about feeling powerful, feeling chosen, feeling superior to those dead churches and lukewarm Christians. But they seem so passionate, I said. Passion without truth is just noise, he replied. They claim to speak for me, to hear my voice directly, to operate in my power, but half of what they attribute to me I never said. They've mixed my truth with superstition, with spiritual manipulation, with a hunger for signs and wonders that actually distracts from the real work I called them to do. He pointed to a woman near the front who was weeping as the preacher laid hands on her, declaring her healed from an illness. She'll go home still sick, Jesus said quietly, and she'll blame herself. She'll think she didn't have enough faith. She'll carry guilt and shame on top of her suffering. And nobody in this church will help her with that burden because they're too busy maintaining the illusion that faith always produces immediate visible results. I felt anger rising in me. That's cruel. It is, he agreed. And it's being done in my name. They've turned faith into a formula, turned prayer into a demand, turned my grace into something they can manipulate and control. They say they believe in my sovereignty, but everything they teach suggests they think they're in control if they just use the right words, claim the right promises, have enough faith. This church doesn't belong to me because they've made faith about them, not about me. It's about their power, their authority, their ability to command spiritual forces. I'm just the source they plug into. They've turned me into a cosmic vending machine. Put in enough faith, get out your miracle. The weight of his words settled on me like a stone. And then came the third church, the one that in some ways hurt the most to see. The third place was smaller still, an old building, traditional in every way, dark wood pews, a simple pulpit, hymn books in the racks. The congregation was modest in size, mostly older people, dressed formally. Everything was proper, orderly, dignified. The service proceeded with careful precision. Traditional hymns sung from memory, prayers read from a book, a sermon that was technically correct, theologically sound, but delivered with all the warmth of a legal document. I waited for Jesus to point out what was wrong. "Do you see it?" he asked, as he had before. I looked at the people. They sat quietly, properly. They followed along with the liturgy. They nodded at the sermon's points. Everything seemed correct. But then I noticed something. There was no joy, no life, no sense of actual encounter with the divine. It was all form, all structure, all correctness, but it was empty. "This church belongs to the law," Jesus said, and his voice carried a different kind of sorrow. "Not my law. Not the law of love I came to fulfill, but a man-made system of rules and regulations and traditions that has slowly replaced any real relationship with me." He showed me a young couple near the back. They had questions about their faith, doubts they were wrestling with, but the atmosphere here made it clear that questions weren't welcome. Doubts were signs of weakness. The path was narrow, the rules were clear, and deviation was dangerous. "I came to set people free," Jesus said, "but this church has bound them up again. Bound them in tradition, in expectation, in fear of stepping outside the lines. They've forgotten that the law was meant to lead people to me, not to replace me." I watched as an elderly woman entered late, clearly struggling with some burden. A few people glanced at her with disapproval. No one moved to help her find a seat. She slipped into the back row alone, and no one spoke to her. "Where is the love?" Jesus asked. It wasn't really a question. I said, "They would know you are my disciples by your love for one another." But this church has replaced love with correctness, grace with judgment, mercy with rules. "They know my words," he continued. "They can quote scripture better than either of the other two churches. They pride themselves on sound doctrine, but they've missed the entire point. They've turned faith into an exam they think they're passing, while they fail the only test that matters. Do they love?" He gestured to the preacher who was delivering a technically accurate sermon about sin and judgment. "Everything he's saying is true," Jesus said, "but it's truth without grace, law without love, correctness without compassion, and that makes it a lie. Because I didn't come to condemn the world, but to save it. But this church seems to think its job is to condemn it." Then Jesus turned to me with a question I wasn't ready for. "Clint," he said, and the use of my name pulled me back from observing to being directly addressed. "Do you understand what you've seen?" "I think so," I said slowly. "3 churches. One worships money and success. One worships experience and power. One worships tradition and correctness. And none of them actually worship you." "Yes," he said. "But there's something more I want you to understand." He led me back to that first sanctuary where we'd started, the one that seemed to contain elements of all church buildings. But now I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a door at the back I hadn't seen initially. "Come," he said. We walked through that door, and suddenly we were in a small, modest space, maybe 50 people gathered in someone's living room. No stage, no production, no perfect lighting, just people sitting together, some on couches, some on folding chairs, some on the floor. They were praying together, not performed prayers, but real conversation with God. One person was crying, sharing a struggle, and others had hands on their shoulders, praying with them. Another was reading from the Bible, and they were discussing it together, not as lecture, but as dialogue, wrestling with what it meant for their lives. There was no pastor dominating the space. There was no show. There was just community, real and messy and authentic. "This," Jesus said, and his voice held something different now. Not sadness, but warmth. "This is mine." "But it's so small," I said. "So simple." "Yes," he agreed, "but look closer." I did, and I saw what he meant. These people were actually encountering him, not just talking about him, not just seeking things from him, not just following rules about him. They were with him. They were learning to love each other. They were serving their neighborhood. They were changing because they were being transformed by actual relationship with God. A church that belongs to me, Jesus said, isn't defined by its size or its budget or its programs or its traditions. It's defined by whether the people are actually seeking me, actually being changed by me, actually loving each other the way I love them. He gestured back toward the 3 churches we'd seen. Those places have forgotten that the point isn't to build an institution. The point is to know me and to help others know me. Everything else, all the programs and buildings and systems, those are just tools, but they've made the tools into the point. They've forgotten why the church exists. And then I woke up. I was back in my bed in California. The clock said 3:47 a.m. My heart was pounding. The dream was still vivid, more vivid than any dream I'd ever had. I could still see Jesus' face, still hear his voice, still feel the weight of what he'd shown me. I got up because I knew I wouldn't sleep again that night. I went to my study and I just sat there in the dark thinking about what I'd seen. Here's what I've been wrestling with ever since. I've been going to church most of my life. Not consistently, not perfectly, but enough. And I've seen elements of all 3 of those churches in the places I've been. The prosperity focus, the emotional manipulation, the dead tradition, sometimes all in the same place. And I participated in it. I've nodded along with sermons that told me God wanted me to prosper. I've enjoyed the emotional high of passionate worship without really examining whether I was seeking an experience or seeking God. I've sat quietly in services that were all form and no life, and I've told myself it was fine because at least I was there. But that dream won't let me sit quietly anymore. Because if Jesus is right, if those churches don't actually belong to him despite all their activity and all their believers and all their certainty, then a lot of us have been missing the point. We've been playing church while missing the entire purpose of church. I'm 94 years old. I don't have time to waste on things that don't matter. And I'm not interested in being part of something that bears Christ's name, that doesn't actually bear his spirit. So I've been asking myself some hard questions. The same questions I think we all need to ask. Am I seeking Jesus, or am I seeking what Jesus can do for me? Am I pursuing a relationship with God, or am I pursuing an emotional experience? Am I following Christ, or am I following a tradition? Am I part of a church that's actually trying to embody what Jesus taught, or am I part of something that's using his name for other purposes? These aren't comfortable questions, and I don't have perfect answers. But here's what I know. The Jesus I encountered in that dream, whether it was actually him or just my conscience speaking in his voice, that Jesus cares deeply about authenticity. He's not impressed by big buildings or big budgets or big programs. He's not moved by emotional displays or perfect doctrine or long traditions. He's looking for people who actually want to know him, who are willing to be changed by him, who love each other sacrificially, who care about the things he cared about, the poor and the broken and the marginalized, who are humble enough to admit they don't have everything figured out, who are brave enough to follow him even when it costs something. And he's looking for churches that exist for those purposes, not churches that exist to make people feel good about themselves, not churches that exist to build empires or create experiences or maintain traditions, but churches that exist to help people encounter God and be transformed by that encounter. I don't know if I've ever been part of a church like that. I've seen glimpses of it, moments of it, but I wonder how many of us have settled for something less, settled for churches that don't truly belong to Jesus, and convinced ourselves it was enough. This dream has made me realize it's not enough, not for me, not anymore. I'm not saying I have all the answers about what a real church looks like. I'm not saying I know exactly how to fix what's broken in American Christianity. I'm not setting myself up as some kind of prophet or spiritual authority. I'm just a man who had a dream that felt true, that revealed something I needed to see, that won't let me go back to business as usual. And I'm sharing it with you because I think you need to see it too. If you're in a church that's really about money and success, ask yourself if that's what Jesus actually taught. If you're in a church that's really about emotional experiences and spiritual power plays, ask yourself if that's really the gospel. If you're in a church that's really about rules and tradition without love, ask yourself if that's really what following Jesus looks like. And if your honest answer is no, then maybe it's time to look for something different, something smaller maybe, something less impressive, but something real, something that actually belongs to him. Because at the end of our lives, and mine is probably not far off, what's going to matter isn't which church we attended or how big it was or how good the programs were. What's going to matter is whether we actually knew him, whether we actually let him change us, whether we actually loved the way he loved. That's the message of the dream. That's what I believe Jesus wanted me to understand and to share. Thank you for listening.